State-of-the-art US government spy satellites have long been a thing of marvel, but also rumor and conspiracies. And that's due to just how secretive they are. Very little information is ever released, including how much they cost. Really, we just get a few figures when there's been a huge failures and numbers are leaked or thrown around to grab headlines or score political points. But we know they cost a ton. At the same time, the latest commercial imaging satellites don't really have that much worse resolution than what we believe of spy satellites. Right now, there's several commercial ones capable of achieving 30 centimeters, and already some scheduled to launch capable of achieving 15 centimeter resolution. And at least those, we know the price of, and the differences are massive. One has costs approaching that of a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, the other less than the cost of a single plane on that carrier. I've compiled every single piece of information I could possibly find to present what we know and take a look at why the differences are so stark. Is it additional capabilities, including things we don't know about, or just bureaucratic inefficiency and government waste? And if you're personally concerned at all with security, and also just want to get a good deal for your money, look no further than our sponsor, Surfshark. In today's interconnected world, our devices are online around the clock. Whether you're accessing certain websites or connecting to local Wi-Fi networks that might not be entirely secure, Surfshark VPN provides an extra layer of protection for your online browsing, ensuring your activity remains private. With Surfshark, you gain access to over 3,200 servers across 100 countries, and they secure unlimited devices. They also have a ton of extra features too. Just to note one is the alternative ID. It will automatically generate an online name, email, phone number, and all the information needed for those annoying website sign-up forms, and just to protect yourself online from potentially risky websites. So don't wait. Click the link in the description. With it, you'll get 4 months for free. And this offer includes the VPN, that alternative ID, antivirus, alert, and search. And every option comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Again, Surfshark. Personally, I just find this stuff so fascinating. The fact that you can see anywhere on Earth, even the most secure and secretive sites that you could never possibly get into, and all with extremely recent satellite imagery, is just unbelievable and impossible throughout all human history until now. At the same time, with spy agencies at least, doing it all in secret and trying their best to avoid any information getting out. It's a fascinating topic, so let's jump in. First, a bit of background to set the stage. During the Cold War, most spy satellites used film. This made them big and bulky, and limited their lifespan to just a few months when they ran out of film. The first successful series of digital recon satellites were the KH-11s. The first one launched in 1979, and this is where the US is still stuck at today. Now there's been a lot of upgrades and improvements, but every known project for a replacement for the KH-11 has failed. The first was Misty in the 90s, which incorporated technology to make it stealthy. It, along with the related enhanced imaging system, were cancelled after just 2 launches, with total cost an estimated $16 billion when adjusting for inflation. It's likely that with the ending of the Cold War, reduced budgets, and no real rival superpower to observe, this all just complicated and doomed these projects. Then, in the early 2000s, after the events of 9/11 and the beginning of the War on Terror, a new life was given to spy satellites. A huge demand for finding and tracking things like terrorist training camps arose. And this type of enemy was different, presenting all new challenges. They often blended in with civilians, they were frequently on the move, and they didn't have large structured militaries with things like air bases, ships, air defense sites, or intercontinental ballistic missiles that the US was used to. Combating them required a greater emphasis on multiple sensors working together than ever before, like detecting signals from a radio and then rapidly capturing an image of that area with optical cameras or synthetic aperture radar, and trying to do it all before they moved. And this is what the next program, the Future Imagery Architecture, attempted to do. However, it was also a failure, and they completely canceled the optical imaging component of it. The New York Times called it perhaps the most spectacular and expensive failure in the 50-year history of American spy satellite projects. By 2006, it was estimated to have spent $25 billion, or about $40 billion when adjusted for inflation. With this, the US fell back on that KH-11 and restarted production, ordering 2 more which were launched in 2011 and 2013. And that was supposed to be the end. The last of the Keyhole satellites was reported. But after another gap, when possibly other programs might have been attempted and failed, 6 years later, the US again restarted production of the KH-11 and ordered 3 more, launching them in 2019, 2021, and 2022. By comparison, the commercial satellite imaging sector has just skyrocketed over the last 20 years. An entire new industry has popped up around it, and demand for it has a huge range of uses, from agricultural to observe crops, urban planning, map providers like Google Maps, or even me using it mostly for entertainment value here. It's likely this new competition has made intelligence agencies not really know what direction to go in next. Should they just start buying imagery from them and save money, which they actually do on a large scale? Also, now other countries, including potential enemies, can buy commercial satellite imagery and have their own spy capabilities for a tiny price that the US spends for theirs. So what can the government satellites provide that commercial ones don't? What kind of resolution can they achieve? While these satellites are obviously highly classified, there are a few ways to get a good idea. One is simply the size of the primary mirror and the altitude the satellite is at. That's information you can typically find online somewhere, or at least make an educated guess. With that, you can get the max possible resolution, assuming that the mirror is perfect and there's no additional external influences. Late generation KH-11s have been claimed to have a 3.1 meter mirror, which is huge. The most extremes I could find for the highest and lowest parts of the orbit that KH-11s have had was 1,010 kilometers and then as low as 250 kilometers. That means at its highest altitude, the max possible resolution would be 21 centimeters, and at its lowest, when it's closest to the target, it'd be about 5.4 centimeters. Keep in mind though, that's in a perfect world, with a perfect mirror and no other influences. So in real life, it would be a little bit worse. So that's the maximum possible it could ever achieve, 5.4 centimeters. So no, they can't, and they never have been able to read your license plate or a headline on a newspaper. Those are two rumors that have been repeated now for probably half a century. They can do some things like applying different algorithms and processing the image to make them appear to be a high resolution, but it's not actually increasing the resolution. It does help, and it makes them look a lot more clear, and both Maxar and Airbus do this as well, and it's how they offer their so-called 15 centimeter imagery. Again, it's not really, it's just upscaled with some processing and real smart guesswork to make it appear better. We can also get an idea of resolution from the image President Trump tweeted out in 2019. Now, all classified spy satellites are classified, so you can't just go and grab official orbital elements. But there are people who track these things and consistently upload the latest information online. Mike McCants and John McDowell being two. Using this data shows us the exact right location of the satellite at the time. Here, USA 224, which is a KH-11 satellite, was flying directly toward it. With this information, we could figure out the slant range to the site was 386 kilometers. With that figure, again, with the largest claimed mirror that it has, gives us a possible maximum resolution of about 8.3 centimeters. And again, as always, keep in mind that that is the best possible, and in real life it would be somewhat worse. Getting much more information from the image alone is a challenge since it's a picture of a picture. And then the more officially declassified one that President Biden later released is a scan and at somewhat lower resolution. So overall, the exact resolution that the latest KH-11s can achieve will vary depending on altitude, but it's likely between 10 to 15 centimeters, especially since the recent ones have been staying in a slightly higher orbit. If we compare that with commercial industry giants like Maxar and Airbus, those both have their own 30cm satellites, Worldview 3 and Pleiades Neo 3 and 4. And while that's a far way off from KH-11's 10 to 15 centimeters, they're in a higher orbit, both just over 600 kilometers. If they were put in a lower orbit, say down to 300 kilometers, they would theoretically be capable of achieving about 18cm resolution, which is much closer in line with the KH-11s. So really, they aren't all that worse. One reason they stay at higher altitudes is because it's more stable with less drag. Lower orbits require more fuel usage to maintain its orbit so it doesn't fall back to Earth and burn up. KH-11s are significantly larger and carry more fuel to maneuver, weighing in at closer to 20 tons. Pleiades Neo and Worldview are closer to 1 and 3 tons respectively. It's also important to note that there is a theoretical maximum possible resolution that a satellite can achieve due to atmospheric turbulence. Things like water vapor, particles, and gases in the atmosphere bend and scatter light. From this, the maximum possible resolution has been stated to be somewhere between 4.6 and 12 centimeters. That's a pretty wide range, and also atmospheric conditions from location to location and at different times will vary, so it's not an exact number. This brings us to cost. Costs are always tricky because there's many ways to calculate it. Do you count just the cost of the satellite to build, or add in the launch cost, maybe the cost of ground control stations and personnel to operate it, and most importantly, the huge cost of research, design, and testing? Commercial satellites are easier as the figures are more public. And also, to keep things level, all the figures here are adjusted for inflation. Reportedly, Airbus's Pleiades Neo, the entire program costed $700 million. That was 4 satellites, 2 of which never became operational as a rocket launching them failed, but that gives us $175 million per satellite. Poland is also reportedly going to be buying 2 of these Pleiadian satellites for their Ministry of Defense. That deal costs $630 million, and it includes the satellites plus a ground control station, training, support, and full access to all imagery Airbus's other satellites capture. That gives us $315 million per satellite, but it's not a real good number to work with because it has additional military requirements, plus includes a lot of those other features. Maxar's Worldview 3 and 4 were incredibly expensive, between $500 and $890 million each. 4 failed after just 2 years, and Worldview 3 is over a decade old now. It was built at a time where they didn't have any real competitors, and they received massive government contracts that easily offset their high price. But Maxar was in real trouble after that Worldview 4 failed. They've been pretty much the dominant powerhouse in commercial imagery until recently. Google had a huge contract with them, and virtually all the imagery you see on Google Maps came from them. But a year ago, Google switched to Airbus. Maxar was down to just one 30cm satellite, while Airbus had 2, meaning double the amount of imagery. But it seems that Maxar is now geared to make a comeback with the Worldview Legion satellites. In the past 10 months, they've launched 6 of them. The whole program reportedly cost just $650 million, putting it at around $108 million each, and that includes everything. If you remove the launch cost of $52 million per launch with 2 satellites in each, that brings the price down to just $82 million per satellite. With government spy satellites, it's almost impossible to know the numbers as they're classified. And even when we do find numbers, it's hard to know whether they include those other costs, like launches, research, development, testing, etc. The few figures we do have is at MISTY and EIS, $16 billion for 2 satellites, which implies $8 billion each. The other comes from a 2014 NRO press release recognizing an employee for their work. It just mentioned that more than $5 billion for 2 systems. We know this person worked on optical imaging satellites, and the satellites at the time would have been the KH-11s. Plus it says that the 2 systems came from, quote, restarting production lines that had been dormant for years. And that fits absolutely perfect with the KH-11s since, as I mentioned earlier, after 6 years without a launch, 2 more were launched, one in 2011 and 2013. So it's safe to assume that this is what they're referring to here. More than $5 billion, I think it's reasonable to assume that means between 5 and 6. Adjusting that for inflation, and also not knowing what year these figures are from, it would likely come to about $7 to $10 billion, or 3.5 to 5 billion apiece. And again, we don't know whether that includes other costs like launch, operation, support, research, design, testing, and so on. But it does give us a general idea when comparing. On one hand, the price per satellite, again, are nearly the same as an aircraft carrier. The other, about the cost of a single aircraft on that carrier. And again, the resolutions, at least at the same altitudes, not being that much different. So why is that? One is obviously all the additional security and secrecy measures required for a huge national security project like this. All the teams, departments, and contractors need to be vetted and have security to avoid foreign countries from stealing the tech, gaining knowledge of exact capabilities, or even sabotaging them. Crazy things can happen, like what we saw in Lebanon when Israeli spies were able to insert explosives into thousands of pagers that went to Hezbollah, and then detonating them. Now, that's an extreme example, but there's endless reports of US defense contractors falsifying records to sell counterfeit or even compromised goods to the military, like faking steel tests and selling weaker steel for decades that was used to build submarines. That doesn't mean that all these stories had some foreign intelligence agency behind it. Often it's just greed and they want more money, but it goes to show why so much security is needed. And all of that slows down development and adds huge costs. Another huge reason for the difference in prices are different requirements. Both are designed to take as high resolution imagery as reasonably possible, but commercial ones have to focus on being cost effective and profitable. So again, the example of Maxar and Airbus staying at higher altitude orbits. They could go lower and capture nearly double the resolution, but that would significantly shorten the operational life of the satellite as it would require more fuel to maintain orbit. That, or be redesigned to carry a lot more fuel, making them a lot larger and heavier, increasing cost at every stage from design to construction to launching. Also, they don't need to change attitude and maneuver as much in orbit. Again, the goal is profit. Government recon satellites are trying to constantly capture as many important sites as possible. They also likely incorporate things like adaptive optics to reduce distortion from the atmosphere. Going back to that Trump image, we can see that it was taken at a pretty large angle, about 45 degrees. Most commercial providers won't even bother with those angles, and not even avoid any images beyond 20 degrees from the vertical due to the distortions and the warp perspective. But this big angle means it's looking through a lot more of the atmosphere, which will hurt resolution. Despite that, in this image there's very little of it apparent, which implies that they might be adjusting to reduce it. So again, all these things greatly increase the amount of rigorous testing needed, its complication, the size, the mass, and again, increasing cost. And it's important to note, since the exact capabilities of government spy satellites are classified, we can't make a 100% fair or accurate comparison. We can make these guesses with reasonable certainty, like with the resolution I was talking about from President Trump's image, past declassified projects, and other recent NRO launches that would potentially indicate that the KH-11s don't have whatever capability that is launching. But there's always a chance they have some extra sensor or capability that we don't know about. And sure enough, this absolutely incredible image taken by Ralph Vandenberg, just taken from the ground using amateur equipment, seems to show additional structures beyond what was believed. He does point out that a lot of these extra features are probably things like solar panels, communications antennas, aperture door, etc. A little note here, you'll see that he says KH-12 while I've been saying KH-11. Some people call the KH-11 Block 3s the KH-12, but honestly, neither name is likely correct, as the government seems to have stopped using the KH designation ever since they become more well known and many declassified. Instead, they seem to be using a 4-digit satellite or mission numbers, such as 2211, 2212, and 2213 that I've come across. So, while it's unlikely, it's interesting to theorize what other potential capabilities that the latest US spy satellites might have beyond those of commercial ones. One might be breaking through that theoretical maximum resolution. Earth's atmosphere is a turbulent mix of gases, water vapor, and particulates that bend and scatter light, which limits resolution. It's why scientists try to get telescopes for observing the universe into space, or why stars appear to twinkle. One way of possibly getting past that could be with something called laser-based atmospheric correction. The satellite would emit a low-power laser at the area that it wants to photograph, then use that reflected light from the beam to analyze its distortion in real time, and with a deformable mirror composed of hundreds or even thousands of tiny actuators, adjust its shape to compensate for the distortion. Similar technology is already in use at the Keck Observatory, which uses a laser star guide and adaptive optics. But if it would ever be practical for Earth observation satellites isn't known. Things like limited size, power, processing capability, and different purposes all come into play. Another is hyperspectral imaging. This is already used in many satellites, just with lesser capability and lower resolution than what intelligence use would require. This is basically capturing a wider range of the EM spectrum beyond just visible light. These could do things like detect chemical signatures, identifying materials like explosives or camouflage, or mid and far infrared, also called thermal infrared. This could see some objects buried underground, or inside buildings, or just hidden from view, and it could do so during the day or at night because it doesn't require visible light. In June 2023, a company called Satellite View launched their first satellite, HotSat-1, capable of thermal imaging at 3.5 meter resolution. Now that's nowhere near the normal visible light imagery we're used to, but it offers some pretty unique capabilities, like here, where you could tell that North Korea had turned on a nuclear reactor, and see at night. This image was taken at night, when most governments and militaries often use the cover of darkness to conceal their activities and movements. And interestingly enough, In-Q-Tel, a company that invests in cutting-edge tech companies on behalf of the CIA to exploit those technologies, actually invested millions of dollars into Satellite View. Thermal imaging can also show things like thermal shadows. Here, for example, created by an aircraft that was parked there but has since moved. That aircraft had blocked the sun, making the ground below it cooler and leaving a visible thermal trace. Then, along the same lines, we'll be combining many different sensors onto one satellite. That future imagery architecture again attempted to do this with both radar and optical imaging, but having these things together, along with the ability to detect signals, would be incredibly valuable, especially in trying to track terrorists or during a war when timing is absolutely critical. Say you detect a signal of concern via a SIGINT sensor, you could then instantly snap an optical image of it to see what's going on, and then also a radar image as well. Each complement each other, providing a much better awareness of the situation. If the sensors were on different satellites, by the time one gets within range, it might be too late and you'll miss it. And finally, AI. Since everyone else is using it, why not satellites? Things like automatically detecting, identifying, counting, and building databases of entire countries. flagging anomalies or any out-of-the-ordinary troop movements or construction, and using it all along with neural networks to predict future developments and locations to monitor. This is something the National Reconnaissance Office is already working on, with a project called Sentient. And it's been reported that the reason Russia has been doing weird things like putting tires on top of its bombers, and even painting fake aircraft on the ground and putting tires on top of them, is all just an attempt to deceive and throw off these automatic AI detection systems used by the US. How effective it isn't known. It looks ridiculous to us, and we would never be tricked. But with things like SAR, things look a lot different. If you didn't know that these were bombers, you would likely have no idea what you're looking at. But, like I said, it's unlikely any of these capabilities are currently active on current satellites, with the exception of AI, which could be just ran from the ground. Instead of any new single huge leap in capability, like the NRO has achieved with each new generation of reconnaissance satellite, all signs point to a shift towards smaller, less capable individually, but much larger fleets of satellites all working together. This would not be a huge leap in capability, it would be a massive one. It was revealed that the NRO signed a secret deal with SpaceX in 2021 that was worth $1.8 billion for hundreds of spy satellites based on the Starlink satellite called Starshield. In essence, it just removes the actual Starlink payload and in its place install a wide selection of military payloads. Things like optical imaging, SAR, infrared missile launch detection and tracking, communications, really anything you want. And they're already pushing full steam ahead. In fact, the NRO has not launched anything else but Starshield since April 2024. That's 126 Starshield satellites in less than a year. Depending on how many they end up with, they could get to a point where they'd have non-stop 24/7 coverage of any spot on Earth, in a similar way that Starlink does. I set up a simulation, and with 70-degree inclination and roughly 580-kilometer orbit that they've been being launched into, you could achieve 100% coverage between 70 degrees north and south with between 700 to 2,000 satellites. The reason for that wide range comes from what elevation above the horizon tracking could occur, and then also padding for handoff time for a seamless transition from one satellite to another. And this is the bare minimum, meaning that you'll only be able to track one single object or site for roughly every 600 kilometers. When the satellites overlap, especially the closer you get to the poles, the number of objects you can track would increase. If they achieve this, it would be an absolutely massive change. The NRO and satellite imagery has always been more strategic. The time that it took from the satellite taking the image to extrapolating any useful information was just too long, especially in the days of film. But being able to continuously monitor and tracking targets and relaying that information in real time to units on the front line or higher command to order a strike, the possibilities become limitless, and suddenly the NRO becomes a lot more tactical. Basically, these things could take the place of virtually all recon aircraft, from the ancient U-2 to UAVs like the Global Hawk. So while the current operational giant spy satellites cost a huge fortune, it's likely their reign is coming to an end with the birth of smaller mega constellations.